Hey folks, Nathan P. Butler here. If you've been following the channel, you should have known this was coming, I'm sure, because I am, of course, a big fan of Star Wars, lots of Star Wars content here on the channel, and among the board game content that I cover, I also tend to lean towards deck building games. So, of course, Star Wars the Deck Building Game would come up at some point. Well, now they've just released the second core set for Star Wars the Deck Building Game from Fantasy Flight Games. So in this video, we're going to have a content overview for both the original set and the Clone Wars edition, essentially the second core set. We're also going to take a brief look at what makes them different. There's really not much aside from just the fact that it's different factions that are involved in the game. So let's dive into it. Again, this is a content overview video, not an exhaustive video about rules or anything. There are plenty of those out there for the game, but I will touch on them as we touch on components. So we start with the original set, focused on the original trilogy. We have Star Wars the Deck Building Game, of course, Luke versus Vader there. Fantasy Flight Games, game designed by Caleb Grace, and Star Wars there. On this end, just the logo again with Fantasy Flight Games. Same thing on that side. Spine, title there, image, the Fantasy Flight Games symbol, 30 minutes, 2 players head-to-head. More on that in a moment. Same kind of thing on the other side. And then the back gives us a sense of what this is all going to be about. Star Wars the Deck Building Game. The fate of the galaxy is in your hands. Experience epic strategic battles in Star Wars the Deck Building Game. This easy-to-learn game reimagines the conflict between the Galactic Empire and the Rebel Alliance in thrilling head-to-head gameplay. Recruit characters, collect bounties, use the Force, and destroy the enemy base. Over 50 unique cards. Take command of your favorite characters, vehicles, and starships. Iconic bases. Choose your base from 10 different locations. Each one has a powerful ability. Component list. Same information as we saw there on the side. Disney, StarWars.com, other logos and whatnot there, your legalese and so forth there. It does recommend 3 packs of gray Gamegenic sleeves. I do use Gamegenic sleeves, as we will see here. I use the matte kind for this one. And of course the UPC there. And for what it's worth, it does have a decent storage setup inside. You had a couple of deeper wells here, a deeper well over here you could stick various things into. You got a bigger well with a little divider here, and some sunken parts here to put cards on. So essentially, the way that I do it at least is I use this for a little baggie full of counters and whatnot. I use these for some components that I actually brought in to play some of the solo variants from BGG. Over here in this part, I keep the always available cards, the Outer Rim Pilot and little Force track board, little foldable card thing. And this is where I put the bulk of the cards with the bases and starter cards for either faction on top of these. So a decent little storage solution, but you aren't going to be able to fit multiple sets in one box, unless maybe you don't sleeve, but I'm not even sure if you could do it even if you didn't sleeve. The other box, for what it's worth, for Clone Wars is organized the same way, so we won't need to look at it. As the interior, it's just the logo around each side, and yes, I almost forgot to show you this, so here's my stuff in there, sleeved. You got your rulebook here, fairly well explained. Decent imagery, pretty decent little book here. I mean, nothing special, not a ton of examples, but examples where it counts. If you're familiar with deck building games, it's going to be an easy game to learn, but there are some key differences in how it plays compared to sort of the standard deck building game style that you might have seen from something like a Star Realms or a Hero Realms or an Ascension that all kind of come from the same lineage. This is sort of a tweaked formula. Now, as far as non-card components, we basically have these here, though this is sort of 2 cards connected there. I actually sleeved that board from both ends. This is the Balance of the Force track, and this is the Force marker. You're going to find that it starts on the Rebel end at the beginning of the game, and the idea is that as you do things that change the balance of the Force, it moves along this track. If it's in any of these 3 spaces, the Force is with the light side, with the Rebels. If it's in the center, it's with no one. It's in balance. If it's on this side at all, it is with the Imperials. There are certain abilities that when you play them, it makes a difference whether the Force is on your side or not. If the Force is with you, you typically get some type of bonus. Also, you'll notice here a little +1 and a supply symbol. You may be familiar with that supply symbol from many, many other Star Wars Fantasy Flight games. Always weird to say that, but games is in their name. So at the beginning of your turn, you get 1 extra resource to use to purchase things. What are those represented by? Well, unlike in most deck building games where you're expected to just keep track of your currency to buy things sort of in your head, this game actually uses these 20 yellow cubes. So when you play cards that give you resources to be able to spend to buy other cards, you're actually taking these from the supply and then putting them back as you spend them, or at the end of your turn. It's still a game where the currency does not persist between turns. So either way, these are all going back to the pool at the end of your turn, but it is a way to keep track of how much you have and how much you've spent during a given turn. I'm not sure that it's necessary. Most deck building games don't need something like that, but if this is being seen as sort of an introductory deck building game for some, then yeah, I guess it kind of makes sense to have those. As for these, you have 50 purple damage cubes over here. The idea in this game is that you are trying to take out 3, or however many is agreed upon, bases of the opposing side by dealing damage, and the damage does stick over time. Kind of like dealing damage to the health of a character in Hero Realms, or dealing damage to the authority of a side in Star Realms, and so on. You will also have capital ships that act essentially as blockers to protect the base, and they also have damage that persists on them. Kind of like, again, to go back to the Star Realms, Hero Realms example, the champions, or the guards, or the bases, or outposts from those games, and how in some cases you have to attack them before you can attack the other player. Essentially a similar concept, except the damage is persistent on those capital ships, whereas in those games, if you don't knock them out in one go, nothing happens. As mentioned, that balance of the force track, it is essentially just cardstock, identical on both sides. What I did was I put sleeves coming in from either side to protect it. There's plenty of aftermarket versions of this you can find on places like Etsy. I just sleeved the one that came with the game. Now, as this is a 2-player game, you'll have yourself 2 of the little reference cards here that indicate the turn sequence on one side, and as a reference for icons and terms on the other. Bear in mind that these are slightly updated for the Clone Wars edition because there's a significant change to the Exile keyword and how it works. As is typically the case with the deck building game, you're going to have yourself an always available card, a card that sits out there persistently so that no matter what's happening in the river or the row, they call it the galaxy row in this game, as far as what you can purchase or go after, this one is always there as another option to pick up if there's nothing else you want to pick up. There are 10 copies of Outer Rim Pilot with Boshek there, which gives us a glimpse at how these cards are designed. So the bottom in this case tells us this is from the Outer Rim Pilot deck, just that stack of 10 cards here. There's a name. It tells us it's a unit. There is a difference between a unit and a capital ship, as we will see. There's always some type of card text, typically with some type of flavor text to go with it. So in this case, exile this unit, meaning remove it from the game to the box, at least the way that this one is laid out. It does play out differently for Clone Wars Edition. But exile it, remove it from the game, trash it, whatever you want to call it, scrap it, depending on what game you're familiar with, to gain 1, and that symbol there is the Force. Okay, so that is what will move it along that balance of the force track one direction or another. When you gain it, it moves towards you. This yellow symbol in the corner, that is the cost in resources, hence the cubes for resources being yellow. And that symbol there, 2 with the little supply symbol, that is 2 resources. When you play this card, you gain 2 resources. And as with the bulk of deck building games, you're not paying to play a card. Instead, you're paying when you acquire the card, and it's going straight into your discard pile. As soon as your deck is empty and you need to draw again, you shuffle up your discard to make your new deck. The wording for that is slightly changed for Clone Wars Edition, but it's still fundamentally the same mechanism. So as with most deck building games, the starter decks for either side are effectively symmetrical, different art, different names, but doing the same thing. In this case, it is 10 cards, and you're going to draw 5 cards at the end of every turn. This is a typical deck building game in that you're playing everything or discarding everything in a given turn so that you always have a fresh hand, in this case of 5 cards for the next turn. As also is the case with many deck building games, this starting deck leans pretty heavily towards getting currency to buy new cards rather than initially giving you a lot of firepower to do a lot of attacking. So, each one has 7 of their resource generating card, which for the Rebels is the Alliance Shuttle. Notice here, cost of 0 on any of these because they are starter cards here. They even say Rebel Starter or Imperial Starter at the bottom. So you've got a cost, resource, in this case 1 resource, again name, unit. Sometimes there's a keyword, in this case transport, a little bit of flavor text here. So for the Rebels it's the Alliance Shuttle, for the Empire it's the Imperial Shuttle. Then as far as combat goes, that's our other symbol, little blaster symbol. This is the combat power. What this game calls the attack value. We'll see that this works a little bit differently than some deck building games. The equivalent there, unsurprisingly, is a stormtrooper. And they each have a very versatile little sort of wild card here. No pun intended. Cost of 0, but notice there's nothing here. Usually it would be either attack or resources or force. This one's got nothing because Temple Guardian here, when you play Temple Guardian, choose. They gain 1 attack, 1 resource, or 1 force this turn. So it's essentially, again, a wild that you can play. Notice here, the other thing that differentiates these cards, aside from the color scheme being red, as you probably noticed, is that there's a Rebel symbol off to the side here for the Rebel cards. Inquisitor here has the blue symbol in the blue background because it is for the Empire. But again, same action there, same ability. Now, as you play, there'll be a galaxy row of 6 cards out. And one very interesting thing about the way that these play is that your galaxy row cards basically are divided into 3 different factions. Just as what we've already seen is 3 different factions. You got Rebel, Imperial, and that Outer Rim pilot didn't have either symbol. It was a neutral card. Well, either side can acquire a neutral card, and either side can acquire their own card. So, for instance, the Rebels can acquire Luke for 8 resources here. But you can never acquire the other side's card. So an Imperial player can never acquire Luke Skywalker. That wouldn't make thematic sense. So we'll see there's something else on these Galaxy Row cards that the other ones don't have. So there's still the cost, attack value. If there's a resource value, it would be there, like for this one here. Force value we're seeing here for the first time. We have our faction symbol, unit, name. There is a symbol there for unique, as we've seen plenty of times in other Fantasy Flight Star Wars games. Keyword here, in this case, Jedi. Notice this is one of those abilities I was talking about. If the Force is with you, so if it's on your side of that track, destroy a capital ship your opponent has in play. There's all this stuff down here, but notice it's upside down. The idea is, when this is sitting there in the Galaxy Row, if you're the Rebel player, it looks like this. If you're the Imperial player, it's facing the Rebel player, so it looks like this. Your text is up here at the top as the Imperial player. Instead of acquiring the card for resources, you can actually attack this card. They call it either sabotaging if you're the Rebels or bounty hunting if you are the Imperial. You can spend that much attack value, and we'll see how that works, because again, it is not as simple as in some other games. You can take out Luke here for 8 attack power and get this reward, which is optional. Abilities and rewards always optional in this game. So in this case, if you take out Luke, you get 4 resources, and the Force moves 4 spaces towards you on that track, which is pretty solid, but it's a heck of a target to try to hit. So the Rebels have 9 unique unit cards. We have Luke Skywalker, Han Solo, Chewbacca, Jyn Erso, Princess Leia, the Millennium Falcon, Cassian Andor, Chirrut Imwe, and Baze Malbus. You can guess that, yes, this was heavily inspired by both the original trilogy and its sort of precursor, not really a prequel because there were prequels, its quasi-prequel, Rogue One. Then for its regular non-unique units, we have Duro Spy ×2, Rebel Commando ×2, Snowspeeder ×2, U-Wing ×2, another one from Rogue One, B-Wing ×2, Y-Wing ×2, and the only one that has 3, as far as units go, are X-Wings, appropriately enough. Notice, by the way, that despite the fact that one is essentially a character, the other is essentially a type of ship, they're both still units. The only distinction here is unit or capital ship. So a starfighter still counts as a unit. Speaking of capital ships, here's an example of a capital ship. The big difference with the capital ship is that when you put it out to play, unlike units that go away at the end of your turn, just like in typical deck building game fashion, you play the card, you use it, it's gone. These persist, much like bases or champions in the Wise Wizard games that I've mentioned previously. So you still have your cost. It still has an attack value in this case. There may be a resource value. On some cards, no force, notice there. It says capital ship. Notice it is horizontal. Still has a symbol in the name. And in this case, it's got some flavor text here. Some of them may have game text. And there's a value down here in the corner. In purple, just like those purple damage cubes, this is the damage needed to destroy it. So when you play a capital ship, it's going to go out into play, and it's going to stay out there until it has enough damage on it to destroy it and send it back to your discard pile. But while one of these is out there, any of them, not special ones, any capital ship, your base cannot be attacked in a regular attack action. So the Rebels have 2 copies of Mon Calamari Cruiser, 2 of Hammerhead Corvette, and then 2 of Rebel Transport. Now I should note here that all these cards that could go into your deck have this back here. However, you're also going to have some cards with faction-specific backs. These, in this case for the Rebels, are your bases. There's always one that's going to be the starting base in the game regardless. They'll say base up here, faction, name, unique symbol here. In this case, the special ability for this Rebel Outpost is start the game with this base in play. Again, there is a purple area down here, not a purple number, but a purple area with a white number in it that tells you how much damage it can take before it is destroyed. And the game is set up, at least in the rules as you're first learning to play, as having 5 available bases for the Rebels. You have Dantooine with a health of 8. Mon Cala, notice a different ability here with a health of 10. Hoth with 14. I love the Planetary Shield ability there. Sullust with 16. And Yavin 4 also with 16. Then after your first plays, they say to go ahead and play the full Galaxy mode, which is to put all the other planets into the mix. That would include Dagobah with a health of 12, Bespin with 14, Jeddah with 14, Tatooine with 14, and Alderaan with 14. And the idea with these is that these are sitting out in your play area, starting with Dantooine. And when one of them gets destroyed, you take all the other ones that you have, sort through them, and pick a new one. When one is destroyed, though, you don't just immediately put that new one into play. That waits to the beginning of your next turn. That way, you can't put one in play and then immediately the enemy attacks it on that same turn and just keeps piling on and piling on and piling on. Any excess damage beyond what's needed to destroy a base is just lost. But typically, your bases, except your starting one, are going to have some type of ability. It might be when something happens. It might be while it's your base. It might be when you reveal it and put it out for the first time, something happens. It definitely varies. But you have some nice variability in the different abilities of your planets. In a standard game, or a beginner game you might call it, what the rules lay out for the first time for you, when you're just playing with a total of 5, the goal is to destroy 3 of the other side's bases. They advise if you're doing full Galaxy, where you're using all of them, to go to 4 instead. But you can vary the length of the game by how many bases you and your opponent agree that you need to destroy to win. I've actually seen it also done where, unlike what the rules say, you can actually handicap for newer players versus more experienced players by having the more experienced players have to destroy more bases than the new players do. You got a lot of control because of just being able to vary the number of bases that need to be destroyed to win. But that's all that Rebel scum. Let's take a look at the Imperial units here, starting with their unique ones. Unsurprisingly, they have Darth Vader, their most powerful and most costly, Moff Jerjerrod, Admiral Piet, Boba Fett, who is not considered neutral, he is an Imperial card, Director Krennic, Grand Moff Tarkin, and General Veers. Notice only 7 of these for the Imperials. I would note, by the way, having mentioned a moment ago that the Force starts all the way on the Rebel side, all the way on the light side, the Empire does always go first to offset that. So you'll notice that there's a balance to the factions, but not necessarily a symmetry to the factions, if that makes sense. So as far as other units go, we have 1 copy of the AT-AT, 2 copies of Death Troopers, 2 of Scout Trooper, 2 of AT-ST, 2 of Landing Craft, 2 of TIE Bomber, 2 of TIE Interceptor, and 1 2, 3 of TIE Fighter. Then they have their capital ships. We have 2 copies of Star Destroyer, 2 of Imperial Carrier, and 3 of Gozanti Cruiser. You then have the 10 bases for the Empire, though again, 5 of them are assumed for your early games, the other 5 only when you start doing the full Galaxy variant of play. So we have Lothal as the starting one, no real ability other than just being the starting one, health of 8 again. Then we have Endor, Coruscant, Death Star, and Corellia to round out the initial ones. And if you're playing the full Galaxy and add the other 5, you got Rhodia, Mustafar, Ord Mantell, Kafrene, and Kessel as your planets. As with the Rebels, you have a special card back specifically for those Imperial bases. But that's not all, right? We still have the neutral cards to look at, starting with their unique. Notice neutral cards have no way to bounty hunt or sabotage. Again, different names for the exact same concept of just paying an attack, basically, to knock something out of the row. You don't have anything like that on neutral cards. There is, however, a variant where you can basically pay them off. You pay the same amount as you would to acquire a card, but instead you just discard it instead, as a way of sort of clearing spaces in the Galaxy row. One of the things most complained about when it comes to this game is the fact that the Galaxy row can be clogged with cards that either you don't want or that are all for your opponent without any of your cards being out there to be purchased. That is one way to use a turn and use some resources to clear the row, though still certainly not ideal. So, for the neutrals, we have here as unique characters Lovat, Bosk, Dengar, Lando Calrissian, IG-88, Jabba the Hutt, and then Jabba's sail barge as, of course, a unit, but of course a vehicle. I am glad to see Lobot here. I don't know how many others they would have been able to pull in as neutrals, what other characters they might have wanted to grab, but it's cool to see him in there, given the sheer amount of extra screen time, so to speak, that he's getting within, especially the Marvel comics now in current canon. Then we got all the other units. Let's just start with the ones that are humanoid or whatever first, just to make it easier for me to not drop stuff. So we have 2 copies of Rodian Gunslinger, 2 of Keldor Mystic, one of the few times we're really kind of feeling like it's dipping a little bit more towards prequel-era design, because, of course, those were introduced during the prequels, the Keldor species. Twi'lek Smuggler, 2 of those. Quarren Mercenary, 2 of those. Jawa Scavenger, also 2 of those. And then also with 2 each as sort of the vehicle units, or whatever you want to call them here. Fighter, in this case, we have the Z95 Headhunter, the Fang Fighter, and the HWK 290. Again, 2 copies each of those. And yes, there is such a thing as a neutral capital ship. So we have the Sea-Rock Cruiser, 2 of those, 2 Nebulon B frigates, yes, as neutral, not rebel, and 3 of Blockade Runner, also neutral, not rebel. I guess because you're talking about it in terms of what it does, like running an Imperial blockade, rather than necessarily being the rebels being the ones to run the blockade. By the way, before we move away from the cards from this set, I should note that even though this was the original set, and they hadn't announced any expansions coming, or any new base sets or anything, they did include, even in the first printing, a little tiny lightsaber clashing symbol down here in the corner to indicate that these are from that original trilogy era base set. Before we move on from the core box, let me note here some stuff that I also include in my core box that I have picked up in some other fashion. This game is designed for 2 players, head-to-head, or there is a 2v2 multiplayer mode. There is no solo mode out of the box, but there are a ton of great solo modes that have been created over on Board Game Geek. Jabba the Bot was the one I started with, so it's nice to have that printed out and put into a sleeve. So Jabba the Bot was the first one I was playing. I didn't create it or anything, just the first one I was playing. That requires you to have a D6. So I put in a couple of D6s here to match a couple of D20s, because I really can't stand using the little cubes to keep track of damage on a base. Instead, I spin it down on a D20. By far the most popular solo mode, though, is what's referred to as leaders. So I have printed out the rules for leaders here, and I have printed out in color the board necessary to play leaders and laminated it. So There are plenty of solo options available on Board Game Geek, even well beyond these. But if you want to play solo, you are going to have some type of outside stuff. Okay, so just to give you sort of a basic gameplay example here. You got your Balance of the Force track with the tracker on it to tell you whose side the Force is on. We're going to go ahead and assume that the Force is all the way to the light side, so I can show you an example of something here. We have our always available Outer Rim pilot, and they suggest putting any neutral cards horizontally so it's easy to tell that they are neutral relative to the ones that are oriented towards one player or the other for the Rebels or the Imperials. Notice the Rebel cards are oriented towards the Rebel player. There's our Rebel base. We do have a Blockade run around. It's not a Rebel card, but it was a neutral card acquired on some previous turn or something here. We have another neutral here. Notice the Imperial cards, though, are pointed towards the Imperial player. Notice there's no way to sabotage, or for the Imperials to bounty hunt, a capital ship. There's none of that upside down text, but the units do have that ability. For the Imperial player, we still have Lothal out there, and we have a Gozanti Cruiser there acting as essentially a blocker. So a Rebel player draws their hand. We'll say it's a Z95 Headhunter, Snowspeeder, Lobot, U-Wing, and another U-Wing. Sure, why not? So at the start of the turn, the Force is already all the way to the Rebel side. They get one resource to start with. I'll just put it up here to kind of get it out of the way there. And they gain resources for any capital ships they have in play. In this case, that one says 1, so there's another one. They're already at 2 resources. Then they're going to play the cards in their hand, but it works a little differently than a traditional deck building game where just everything on a card tends to happen at once. So, we're going to play U-Wing and U-Wing. Why play those essentially back-to-back here? Because when you play them, these have a resource value. You gain the resources immediately. So there's 3 more for each U-Wing. The ability on the card does not trigger immediately. That's important to know. Then I'm going to play, let's say, Lobot. He has a choice here. When you play him, he either gains 2 attack, 2 resources, or 2 force. Well, force is already all the way on the light side, so there's no sense in doing that. So he's going to do it for the 2 attack value. So we play him out here. Now, playing them out there does not immediately somehow add combat power or attack power to a pool, as in most games. Like you think Star Realms or Hero Realms, a game like that, which are kind of the stereotypical design of most deck building games. In those cases, you just have a giant pool of attack value that you can spend as you please, just like you can spend your credits or your coins or whatever it is to purchase things as you please. Not in this game. In this game, attacking is a very deliberate and different process than what we would see in many other games. So we're going to play out our Z95 Headhunter and our Snowspeeder. They also have attack values here. We'll just put them here to be used in just a moment. I apologize for the glare on the cards. I don't think moving them up is going to make that much of a difference. On your turn, you can do several different things in whatever order you choose, as many times as you choose. You can play a card from your hand, as we just saw here. You can also use resources to purchase a card from the Galaxy row, including that Outer Rim pilot. So we've got, 8 resources here? Gosh, that's a lot. Let's spend 5, removing them to the supply, to purchase Han Solo. Han immediately goes into our discard pile, wherever we're keeping that, and immediately from the Galaxy row, which would be like over here that you can't see on the screen, out would come a new card. Oh wow, it's an ATST. So it gets oriented towards the Imperial player. So really not a lot of buying options here for the Rebels at this point. They still have 4 they can spend. They could buy a Z95, they could buy Chewie, that's good, but those are really the only options because they cannot purchase Imperial cards. So they're going to pay their 4 here, one of which almost tried to get away from me there, and get Chewbacca. And again, a new card comes out. Cool, it's a Y-Wing, it's a Rebel card, so it's oriented toward the Rebel player. Another thing you can do is use an ability of one of your cards in play. This is where basically exhausting or tapping, they just call it rotating, a card would come in. Again, when you play a card, it doesn't immediately do whatever this text says, unless, like Lawbot, it says, when you play this card. Okay? Otherwise, it's all going to be stuff that is your choice as to when or if you would use it. So in this case, we have Z95 Headhunter. If your opponent has a capital ship in play, draw a card. Well, sure. We'll rotate and get to draw a card. I've drawn Fang Fighter. That's cool. I'll go ahead and put this into play as well. This has a when you purchase ability, so there's nothing to use of its ability here. We could use a Snow Speeder. Your opponent discards one card from their hand, so I'll tap that and make them discard one. You Wing, if the force is with you, repair 3 damage from your base. That's awesome, but the base has no damage on it, so no point in activating either of those here. But it's all up to you when you activate an ability, and when you do, you just rotate the card as an indicator that you have used that ability this turn, and you can't use it again this turn. Then you can also commit for attacks, and then resolve attacks, which are separate things here. So here's the way attacking works. A unit, which would be like the Z95 Headhunter, the Snow Speeder, any of these, the Fang Fighter that also has an attack value, a unit can either try to attack the other faction's cards in the Galaxy row by, again, it means the same thing, but either sabotaging if you're a rebel going after an Imperial, or bounty hunt if you're an Imperial going after a rebel. But capital ships can't participate in that. On the other hand, capital ships and units can go after the base or capital ships of the other side. So think of it as, you wouldn't use a capital ship to go bounty hunting or a capital ship to sabotage, but you would use a combination of capital ships and other units to try to attack a base or maybe take down an Imperial capital ship or rebel capital ship and vice versa. The way you do that is you're going to commit cards, not combat value. So this is not, again, a combat pool. The fact that I have a Fang Fighter with 3, a Snow Speeder with 2, and a Z95 Headhunter with 2 doesn't mean I just have 7 to willy-nilly spend wherever I want to spend it. Instead, I must commit cards, essentially one at a time, to form groups that are going to attack certain targets. So let's say that I want to, I don't know, just as an example, let's say that I want to take out that Gazanti cruiser there and try to deal some damage to Lothal. But also, I really like the reward on the ATST that lets you exile up to 2 cards from your hand or discard pile, because I want to be able to thin my deck and get some of those starter cards out of there so I can draw better cards more frequently. So when I go after ATST, maybe go after the Gazanti, what am I going to do? Well, the ATST will make that the first priority here. Maybe it's early game. We've got 4 as the value up here to sabotage. So I'm going to take my Snow Speeder and my Z95 Headhunter, and I'm going to commit them to the ATST attack. So both of these were already exhausted, tilted. So in their tilted form, I'm going to put them somewhere in a group to indicate that they're the ones going after the ATST. I add up their value. In this case, it's 4, exactly enough, and I take out the ATST. I could also have committed the Z95 or the Fang Fighter down here. Fang Fighter has 3, Z95 has 2. The extra 1 gets lost. So we'll stick with the Snow Speeder Z95. Notice when I put the Fang Fighter over there, though, it did not change its orientation. That is very important. So I take out the ATST, I get the reward here, and then it gets refilled into the row, let's say with a Twi'lek Smuggler, whatever. Now the ATST goes to the Galaxy Row's discard. Now I want to go after that Gazanti, and it needs 3. So I'm not going to rotate my Fang Fighter. I'm not using its ability. Instead, I am simply placing it somewhere in a group, probably close to over there, to indicate that I'm going after the Gazanti. Attack value of 3, defense value of 3. The Gazanti is destroyed. If I had attacked it maybe with the Snow Speeder instead, it got hit for 2. I put 2 damage counters on it. Those would persist, but it wouldn't be destroyed yet. But because I've taken out the Gazanti now, which again goes to a discard, in this case the Imperial discard pile, I can't fight anymore with the Snow Speeder, the Headhunter, or the Fang Fighter. I've used them this turn. I've committed them. Regardless of what I'm doing with their abilities, they've been committed and engaged in a battle. But now I'm going to commit my Blockade Runner with an attack value of 1 to an attack on the base, knocking Lothal down from 8 to 7, and dropping one of those purple damage cubes on top of it. So there's a lot of unusual stuff going on here. You have the force track which can give you an extra resource if it's all the way on your side, or allow for certain abilities that are pretty strong. But it's a tug of war that goes back and forth throughout the game. You have the fact that each side can only acquire cards of their type or neutral, but they can take out cards of the other side, but not neutral, in order to get a reward. And you have a Star Realms-esque sort of thing where you have capital ships that are acting as blockers for the base, which is what you're trying to destroy, but you're going through multiple bases with different abilities in play. And when you play a card, resources come immediately, and typically you do the force shift immediately as well, but the abilities and the attack values wait for you to actually use them. Abilities when you tap them, or rotate them, which, just like rewards when bounty hunting or sabotaging, are optional, or you can commit them to an attack if they have an attack value. But they are attacking a single specific target, alone or in a group, to get enough power to take out whatever you're trying to take out. You must meet or beat the value if you're trying to sabotage or bounty hunt, because there is no persistent damage in the galaxy row. But you could be shy by a little bit of damage and just leave some persistent damage on those capital ships. You resolve the attack when you want to resolve the attack, after you've committed however many units or capital ships you want to it. But there's also the distinction between units being able to sabotage or bounty hunt in the galaxy row, but capital ships not being able to, whereas both types of your cards can go after bases or capital ships. This is a game that is sometimes derided as a relatively simplistic deck building game. I would argue it is more complex than something like Star Realms, Hero Realms, or Ascension, at least in its base form. But because it's not a CCG or TCG or LCG, it is a very self-contained little game. Sometimes it is thought of as not as complex of a game. Yeah, it's not as complex as a TCG or LCG or CCG, but it is more complex than some other DBGs. Subgenre matters. Now, with all that out of the way, we know how the game plays, we've seen the core set, let's look at the Clone Wars edition. Alright, now let's get to the one that most people are probably watching this to see because it is the newest, which is the Clone Wars edition. Star Wars: A Deck Building Game, Clone Wars Edition, Fantasy Flight, Star Wars, designed by Caleb Grace with Frank Brooks. So very similar. The setup here, Star Wars: A Deck Building Game, then you got the colored area here, Fantasy Flight, and Clone Wars Edition gets its own little special raised area. Star Wars: A Deck Building Game, Clone Wars Edition, 30 minutes, 2 players, head-to-head. Same thing on this side. The ends are also the same. The back is pretty similar to what we just saw for the standard set, the initial set. So, Star Wars: A Deck Building Game, Clone Wars Edition. The fate of the Republic is unknown, and what happens is up to you. This edition of Star Wars: A Deck Building Game pits the Galactic Republic against the Separatist Confederacy, and can be played alone or combined with any Star Wars: A Deck Building Game product, which hopefully suggests there'll be more than just these 2 sets. Clone Troopers and Jedi engage battle droids and Sith in this easy-to-learn and fast-paced game. Over 50 unique cards to take command of your favorite characters, vehicles, and starships. Iconic bases. Choose your base from 10 different locations. Each one has a powerful ability. Again, components, same stuff as on the side. Disney, Star Wars, logos and stuff, sleeve stuff, legalese, UPC. Basically what we saw before. Speaking of which, by the way, in mentioning the sleeves, if you pre-ordered the original game from your favorite local game store and they were participating in the little trade thing, I forget what it's called, that Fantasy Flight Games has going on, you could have gotten some special sleeves with the art of the core set on them. I have not heard thus far of anything similar being offered for Clone Wars Edition, so if you're going to be mixing sets, those custom sleeves are basically meaningless at this point. But I personally wanted a sleeve in the matte sleeves, so I didn't bother to hunt those down. That's the one thing I can't show you here. Inside, same design, all black on one end and the other, and then the red here on the side with just, again, the full logo for the Clone Wars Edition. Of course, we have a rulebook. It is almost identical, except, of course, for switching out images for images from this set. Almost identical in wording and everything else to the original set, but not exactly. We'll be taking a look at that in a little bit when we're done looking at this particular box. Once again, you're going to be tracking your damage, your resources, and the force with 1 white, 20 yellow, and 50 purple cubes. One component that is different is your balance of the force tracker. Yes, it has The Republic and Separatist symbols on either side rather than Rebel and Imperial. Duh. Everything else kind of laid out the same here. But that is if you're playing with the Clone Wars version itself, because that makes sense with the two sides. If you're going to mix and match the sets, which you can, they give you a generic version on the back, which I thought was a nice touch. You again have two reference cards. These are updated, specifically dealing with Exile. We'll talk about that later on when we're talking about the difference between the two games. We again have an always available card in this set, 10 copies of it, and it's Outer Rim Pilot again, just with different artwork here. So again, cost of two resources, exile this unit, which does work differently, we'll see, to gain 1 force, Outer Rim Pilot deck. So nothing special here, just different art. And of course, to keep them compatible, the card backs are the same, just in case that wasn't obvious. And because I already explained how starter decks work, we will wait on the starter decks for just a moment until we see the two different new factions. First, let's look at all the neutral cards. Again, there are 90 Galaxy Row cards in this set, as there were 90 in the previous set. For the neutrals, the units that are unique are Hondo Onaka, Latz Razzie, Zem Wissel, Jar Jar Binks, oh, at least it's a cost of 0, Outcast, I like it, Embo, Cad Bane, Aura Singh, Jango Fett, which is interesting here. Jango is neutral, whereas Boba was Imperial in the original set. And then Fett's Fire Spray, yet another time of making sure not to use the name Slave 1. But in this case, with the paint job meant to be Jango's, because it's the Clone Wars era. Of course, he's, dead once the Clone Wars start, but that's a whole other thing. Then for the other neutral cards, you have 2 copies each, and I only have 1 here, because I kept feeling like I was going to drop everything. We have 2 copies each of Underworld Contact, Super Commando, Protocol Droid, Weequay Pirate, Assassin Droid, Gauntlet Starfighter, Hutt Fighter. Then for neutral capital ships, we have 2 copies of Dreadnought-class Cruiser, 2 of Aurora, I think that's how you say that, class Freighter, and then 3 copies of Space Yacht. Now we can start talking factions, and the first one we'll look at here is essentially the dark side version, the Separatist Confederacy, Separatist Alliance, Confederacy of Independent Systems, the Separatists here. With a starter deck, this is effectively like what we saw with the original set, because of course they want to make sure that they are fully compatible. So our one that's the wild card here is Dark Side Agent. Our one that is for combat is the B1 Battle Droid, and then the one for gaining resources is Separatist Shuttle. They all now say Separatist Starter at the bottom, have that symbol there. They are blue-themed like the Empire. And again, it is 7 of the Shuttle, 2 of the Fighter, and 1 of the Wild Card, for a total of 10. Then we have our units, starting with the unique ones. We have Count Dooku, Newt Gunray, Admiral Trench, General Grievous, Asajj Ventress, and Wat Tambor. So 6 uniques for the Separatists. For other units, there's 1 of the AAT, and then 2 each of Tri-Fighter, MTT, STAP, and Droideka, then Magna Guard. But then you have 3 copies each of B2 Battle Droid and Vulture Droid. Then for the Separatist capital ships, you have 2 each of Munificent class Frigate and Separatist class Dreadnought, and then 3 of Droid Control Ship. This card here, by the way, has a good example of this new Exile thing for Clone Wars Edition. So just in brief, I'll deal with it more later on. In the original game, if you were exiling a card, it's just back to the box. It's completely out of the game. It's like scrapping, trashing, whatever. It was just gone. There was no place even in the playing area to put it because you're supposed to put it back in the box. In this game, in the Clone Wars Edition, anytime you exile, you put it in an exile pile, and each player has their own exile pile, because some cards like this one, purchase a droid from your exile pile as if it were in the Galaxy Row, actually let you manipulate cards that are in the exile pile if they're in yours typically. So for the Separatists, that's a big part of their new mechanisms, so you need to actually have exile piles there on the table. So you have your deck, your discard pile, and your own personal exile pile, where basically the cards just sit there dead and you're not really messing with them unless there's some specific ability that lets you go to your exile pile and do something, like Droid Control Ship. Now, before we look at bases, let's go ahead and take care of the Republic side. Republic symbol there. The red background here, a little bit dimmer red. They're not exactly the same blue and red, but they're close. Otherwise, same layout here. So for our unique units for the Republic, we have Aayla Secura, Captain Rex, Mace Windu, Ahsoka Tano, Clone Commander Cody, Padme Amidala, Anakin Skywalker, Obi-Wan Kenobi. One thing I think would be interesting is if in the future we perhaps see a way to do something with Anakin and Vader treated as if they're the same character somehow. There's nothing in there quite like that yet. Or maybe to see an Ahsoka that is perhaps a neutral, given the time frame that she might be in. But for the Clone Wars, at least, it makes sense. These are what they are. And for the Republic's non-unique units, we have one copy of ATTE, and then two each of LAAT, L-A-A-T Gunship, ARC 170, V-19 Torrent, Delta 7B, Bark Trooper, AT-RT, and then 3 copies of ARC Trooper. Then for the Republic capital ships, we have 2 each of Venator-class Star Destroyer, Acclimator-class ship, and Consular-class cruiser. You'll notice, by the way, that all of these have a little symbol with a Clone Trooper helmet in the corner to indicate that these are from the Clone Wars edition. And I almost forgot to show you the starter deck cards, but yes, they are, again, essentially the same as what we saw before. We have Jedi Knight here as the wild card, 1 copy of that. Republic Shuttle here as the one to get your resources, 7 of that, and then 2 of Clone Trooper, which is the one that gets you some initial attack. Then for your Separatist bases, we have Zorn, which is the starting one, Dak, Felucia, Geonosis, and Mygeeto to wrap up those initial 5, because again, it is suggesting a specific 5 to use for your first games. Then once you go to full Galaxy and you're using all the bases, the other 5 are going to be Onderon, Cato Nemoidia, Lola Sayu, Mustafar, and Sereno. Then for the Republic, whose symbol, yes, is very similar to that of the Empire. That's just kind of always been the case because the Republic became the Empire. Just know there is a color coding, and they are slightly different symbols, at least, if you're trying to sort cards out later. We have Rishi, which is the starting one, and the other initial 4 are Anaxes, Kamino, Coruscant, and Ryloth. Then the ones for full Galaxy, we have Kashyyyk, Naboo, Rhodia, Christophsis, and Ilum. So that's all of the Clone Wars edition. Before we go, let's take a look at the very minor differences between these sets in terms of rules or what they all include. I would note here that in the original game, in the glossary section, they include a definition for must. As far as it being mandatory, that definition is not found in the Clone Wars edition. There is, however, in its place, another definition in the Clone Wars edition that's not in the original, which is a definition for look, where you look at something secretly and then put it back. In the original version, they use sort of the standard deck building game terminology of you will shuffle your discard to create a new deck when you need to draw a card from your deck and it is empty. The Clone Wars edition instead refers to it as when you need to interact with your deck and it's empty. So maybe you have a card that lets you look at the top card of your deck, but your deck is empty. That would trigger, by the rules of the Clone Wars edition, a reshuffle so that you could still use that ability instead of it just whiffing because you have no deck there. It won't come into play very often, but that is, at least as far as deck building games, somewhat of a significant difference in how they play. I would not be shocked if later printings of the original game were to update that terminology. Again, as mentioned before, the Exile rule is very different and laid out in a little bit more detail within the Clone Wars edition. In the original game, it is simply Exile means return to the box, it's out of the game, it's gone, that's it. With Clone Wars edition, you put them into an Exile pile just for you, as your opponent does as well, as there may be cards that let you interact with an Exile pile. And I would note here, it's your Exile pile because it's you that did the exiling, not because of whose card it was. So if you exile a card, say from the Galaxy row, it would still go into your Exile pile. Also, there are different advanced or variant game modes that each of these 2 explain. In the original rulebook, there's a game mode that's not mentioned at all in the Clone Wars edition, which is the Secret Bases variant, where basically you still play like in the beginner game, where there's only 5 bases total, which will be your starting one, and then 4 other ones. Again, the ones you choose after a base is destroyed. In the beginner game, it's the 5 that I've mentioned previously, always. But in the Secret Bases version, you choose secretly 4 other bases to go with your starter, so you're still playing with 5, except your opponent doesn't know which ones are even in your pool to choose from, let alone which ones you're going to actually pull out and use. They do suggest that if you're going to do that, you should go to 4 destroyed bases for a win, not 3 as in the beginner game. They both include the full Galaxy mode, which is where you play with all the bases and you're playing to 4 destroyed bases typically. So that hasn't changed. The thing that has replaced the Secret Bases version in this rulebook in its place is a mixed cross-edition play version, which gives you the rules on how to combine these together. We'll talk about that more in just a moment. They do both have a 2v2 team mode listed, except of course, given that this was the only one that was out at the time that this one came out, it actually requires 2 copies of that base game, the same base game, whereas Clone Wars Edition presumes that you're going to be using the 2 different ones. And then there is a frequently asked questions in each one. Unsurprisingly, it's more that the difference is in which specific cards they need to address that are just in those sets. There are specific FAQ questions, for instance, in the original game for Scout Trooper, Duro Spy, and Yavin 4. For Clone Wars, there's specific questions for Geonosis, Megiddo, and 2 questions about exiling. There is also a question that is updated between the 2, whereas in the original game, the FAQ is talking about whether or not you can look into a discard pile at any time, any of the 3 discards, yours, your opponent's, or the Galaxy Row one. The Clone Wars Edition updates that question to also include whether you can look in the exile piles. For what it's worth, all 3 discards and both exile piles, they are all public knowledge. You can look through them at any time. But those are really the only key differences here. It's really just that exile mechanism that is the key here, and the fact that if you own both, now you can mix and match. So how does that work? Honestly, it's pretty straightforward. Each of these, when you look at your Galaxy Row cards, again, they have 90. 30 of those are for one side, 30 for the other, and 30 that are neutral. So first, you're going to have each player pick which faction they're going to play with. And then you're just going to take the neutral cards from one game or the other to play with. And one version of Outer Rim Pilot, but again, they're identical except for the artwork. Then when you use the Balance of the Force tracker, you'll use the one from Clone Wars Edition and flip it over to that side that doesn't have any factions on it, as I mentioned earlier. The only other thing you need to do is remember how I said that in the original game, the Force starts all the way on the Rebel side, but the Empire goes first. Flip it around, in Clone Wars, it starts all the way on the Republic side, but the Separatists get to go first. If you're going to mix and match, you simply decide who's going to be the first player, and then the second player is the one that gets the Force all the way on their side at the beginning as a balancer. Nothing too fancy, but I do find it interesting that you don't actually mix the neutral cards between the 2. I can see why, but it's a little bit disappointing that you're still, no matter which mix and match you're going to be using, you're still going to only see one era's neutral cards. But I'm sure fans will come up with some variants to mix them up. Again, tons of fan variants, including some great solo ones like Leaders that you can find on Board Game Geek. As of the time that I am recording this, there is no Clone Wars adaptation of the Leaders solo variant yet. I'm sure one will be coming at some point in the future because it is so beloved, but you can play with other solo variants like, say, Jabba the Bot that doesn't necessarily require specific factions. And that, folks, is it. That is the end of our look at the original set and Clone Wars edition of Star Wars: A Deck Building Game. I love deck building games. I love Star Wars. This was a no-brainer, and hopefully this helps you decide perhaps which set to get if you're not going to get both, and provides a quick look at the Clone Wars edition for those who are eagerly anticipating it. It was just recently released, but some local game stores and online retailers have not yet started shipping. Don't worry, it's coming soon. This isn't a review copy or anything. I just pre-ordered through Asmodee's website and happened to get it a couple days before release, so I've had a chance to peruse it a little bit longer than some. Sometimes you just get lucky. Oh, the Force is with you, because in my experience, there's no such thing as, well, no, yeah, there's definitely some luck. Never mind. Thanks for watching.